Hey, good evening, everybody. Joe Ellis here. Just doing my week 7 video journal. As we were told, we were supposed to read the AP AI guide. So, AP's guidance on covering AI technologies, and then following that, the short podcast or radio hit on it's called Under the Table. It's about paying in podcasting. So, getting into the first part here, the AP AI guide. When covering AI technology, it lists a few things that journalists should show as they cover those AI technologies. The first being how those systems work, then where are they deployed, how well they perform, whether they are regulated, who benefits and makes money off of those off of the use of that AI, and which communities may be negatively impacted by them. So the first thing there, how the systems work, those AI gain their information from somewhere, typically based on algorithms that predict behavior or predict text, where they're deployed. So I know there's some that are out there for sports statistics. You can ask AI, show me this about a sports team, and it'll do it. How well they perform. So those models are used to predict certain things. They're optimized for certain things. So how well they perform in that area, whether they are regulated is another thing. So is there any yellow tape or red tape that is inhibits or accelerates that AI? Who benefits and makes money? So like I said, excuse me, AI get their information from somewhere, and so is that generating traffic for those things, and are they gaining money from that, and how is that a conflict potentially? And then which communities may be negatively impacted by the use of AI, and we'll get a little bit more into that. So another thing it says is kind of what we talked about already is what are the models used to predict or optimize. So each AI model is optimized for a particular thing. I gave the sports example. There's other things like chatbots, which the AP guide mentions specifically that chatbots are used to predict words or phrases that would typically follow each other in in a specific order. So it's not on a human level of speaking and of comprehension. It is just what the computer or the AI determines is most likely to occur in a certain way. It next says you should find out what checks there are and how they get their information and data. So where does an AI get its information from? It's typically, and again, we'll get a little bit more into this, but Western ideas and where there's a larger digital footprint, and it typically ignores other communities and other areas that don't have as large of a digital footprint. You should also trace the human origins. So somebody makes AI, so that AI will be reflective of that person's ideas and their biases as well. So it next talks about the negative impact on communities through the use of AI. So the first thing is surveillance. So that AI gets this information from somewhere, and that wherever that is surveilling human behavior or typical behavior, and then uses that to predict future behavior. It also can magnify bias. So I mentioned how AI can typically gains its information from a larger digital footprint. That larger digital footprint will have more input into the AI. So there'll naturally be a bias towards communities and areas that have more access to technology. And then transparency issues in the source material. So wherever that source is, they might not be broadcasting where they get their information from, and it creates kind of a conflict in transparency there. Some pitfalls to avoid. I specifically chose this one because I found it kind of humorous. Avoid the images of AI as robots or humanoid machines. I found that humorous, but it is kind of true. You need to, it falsely attributes a human form to what is actually a process of gathering and collecting and then compiling and disseminating information. The next thing we were to cover was Under the Table, which is a short podcast on it gets to starts with an example, but it gets to the process of paying to be on a podcast. So it starts off with payola, which was a process of record labels paying DJs to feature their music. So the DJs receiving money and then playing a certain record label's music so that that record label can therefore gain an audience and a buyer base that will then purchase their records or more likely to purchase their records. So it's a process where both sides economically profit, where and it kind of creates this conflict of interest. And that was originally outlawed by the FCC, but now podcasts are kind of entering a similar situation where podcast listeners or people that want to be featured on a podcast will pay to be on that podcast, be featured on that podcast, and then that podcast will profit, and then whoever that is will also profit. So there was an example that they gave, and that is Entrepreneurs on Fire. So there was a guest that paid $35,000 to be on Entrepreneurs on Fire for 2 sessions. So in 2 different podcast episodes, this person was featured. Then they paid for 12 weeks worth of ad revenue on that same podcast. So the podcasters received money, and they reasoned this with, oh, this is how much money we would typically make in ad revenue. So you pay for that time slot and just the total amount of money that we predict we would have made based on the amount of ad revenue from that time slot. You're going to pay for that, and then you will also profit in getting notoriety. So now that podcasts have kind of become a form of reporting and news and journalism, we've entered a realm where people are paying to receive news coverage. And then that news coverage then allows that person to gain notoriety and gain, you know, I can think of a pretty easy example off the top of my head, Joe Rogan's podcast. So I'm sure the Donald Trump presidency, I don't know this for a fact, but I'm sure they had to pay some sort of money to be featured on that podcast. And then they received votes and notoriety as a result. So we've entered a realm where there's this conflict of interest in news and reporting amongst podcasts, which is concerning.